Let's start with the very beginning, which is teenage brain development. And this is the issue with marijuana. So this is brain development. There's really two phases to it, age 0 through 10, and then the teenage years. And it's totally different. So 0 through 10, what the brain does is every experience we have, it creates a new synapse. And that middle part of the picture there is a 7-year-old brain that's full of all sorts of connections and synapses. And then starting at age 11, what the brain does is what's called synaptic pruning or neural pruning. And it's totally different. What the brain does is it figures out what to keep and what to get rid of and strengthens it. I kind of look at it, it's like if you're writing something, first you get all your ideas down, and then you have to go through and edit it. So editing starts at age 11. And so some pathways are strengthened and refined, others are eliminated. And that picture on the right there is a 15-year-old brain, and you can see there's actually fewer connections in that brain, but they're much stronger. So the idea in synaptic pruning is use it or lose it. So whatever we do in our teenage years, we get really good at, because evolution has created us that during that time, the brain specializes in whatever we're going to do as adults. So if you're doing sports or into music, you'll get really good at it. This is why teenagers learn things really fast and remember it for the rest of their lives, because these skills become hardwired and permanent. So what happens when the teenage brain is using drugs during that period of development? Well, it will specialize and become expert at getting pleasure from addictive drugs. And normal pleasure and addictive pleasure are really quite different. So normal pleasure, happiness, comes from interactions with life. Time with friends, hearing stories, relationships, success, having a career and having success at it, mastering a skill, right? All the things that we do. I mean, I hate to reduce it to neurochemicals, but all these things that we do stimulate the pleasure centers of our brain. Some of them are very adult pleasures. But normal pleasure comes from being engaged with life. Addictive pleasure is very different. It comes from directly stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain. This is a rat with an electrode in the pleasure centers, and it will push that lever forever and ignore food, any other needs. It overrides all the normal paths. Drugs are basically a short circuit. They stimulate the pleasure centers. And so teenage drug users are spending less time engaged with life and more time directly stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain. So what does teenage brain development do? It strengthens the pathways for addictive pleasure, and then they lose some of the pathways for healthy pleasure. And this is permanent. Now, it's not total, but it's to some degree, and it actually shows up in the research. So this is a graph of how often people use marijuana in their teenage years, and that's down at the bottom. So on the left, it says never use marijuana, 1 to 100 times, and most of those people used less than 10 times, and then 100 to 200, 200 to 400, more than 400 times. And what you can see on this is, and they asked them at age 25, they had them do all these things. They rated their satisfaction with their intimate relationships. The more marijuana they used as a teenager, the less satisfaction they had with their relationships, the more dissatisfied with life they were in general. And that's because, I think we don't know this for certain, but that's probably because their brains are altered from the teenage marijuana use, and they lost some of that ability to get pleasure out of life. But they have more ability to get pleasure out of addictive drugs. So all teenage drug use, and I think this includes alcohol and tobacco, will hardwire the brain to get more pleasure from drugs and less pleasure from normal life, and this will be permanent, which is one of the big reasons everyone should be avoiding all addictive drugs until at least age 18. The other reason is addiction. The addictive drug industries, of course, know all about this, and they target teenagers because the developing brain is more prone to addiction. I don't know if I should stress it with this group, but often when I'm talking to people, I have to remind them, addiction is biological, it is hereditary. There's a lot of people who really don't like this. There's certain people just hate the idea, partly because they want to blame addicts or insist that self-control works, but the research all points to the disease concept, and it's a lot easier to treat people that way. Anyway, a lot of marijuana users insist that marijuana is not addictive. I mean, people come to me because they can't stop smoking pot. That's pretty much says it's addictive. But there's a study done by Alex Budney back in '98, and He put an ad in the paper in Burlington, Vermont for people who couldn't stop marijuana, and he got a lot of responses. And they all had really typical symptoms of addiction. They continued to use despite having problems. They kept trying to quit or cut down. The biggest symptom of pot addicts is they spend all their money on marijuana. That's the one I hear all the time from them. And then they don't do things where they can't smoke pot or can't get high. And there's a withdrawal syndrome, which includes irritability and insomnia. Anyway, just a little bit about addiction. There's two ways to look at it. One way is how addictive is the drug? And as far as everybody who's used the drug even one time, 9% get addicted to marijuana. Alcohol's a little bit higher, 15%. Cocaine a little bit more. Heroin and tobacco are much more addictive. Now, it also depends on how often they use it. So, and how early they start using it. And those are the two big things with marijuana: how early in life they first use it and how often they use it. So all users, it's about 9%. Teenage users, 15% get addicted. These are the people who try it even once. All daily users, about 18% get addicted. And daily teenage users, fully a third of them get addicted. Then the other way to look at it is how many Americans are addicted to the drug. And this has to do with how widespread it is. So I didn't even put tobacco on this graph. Alcohol is by far the most addictive drug when you look at how many people are addicted to it in this country. And down there at the bottom is heroin, and we have an epidemic of heroin right now, but it's still dwarfed by these other drugs. When you look at kids under the age of 18, marijuana is the #1 drug of addiction these days. So that's one way that marijuana harms the teenage brain, is it strengthens the pathways for addictive pleasure, making them more prone to addiction. And all drugs in the teenage years do that. There's a second way that marijuana harms the teenage brain, and this is unique to marijuana. Marijuana is actually similar to the neurotransmitters that run teenage brain development. And so marijuana disrupts synaptic pruning. So people who are smoking marijuana in their teenage years, like some of us did, will have altered brain development. Some of the pathways that aren't used will remain, even though they're not being used in the teenage years. Some useful ones might be eliminated or else not myelinated and not reinforced well. And this shows up on brain scans. People use marijuana. All these studies are in fine print down here. People use marijuana as teenagers, have smaller brain, altered gray matter volumes. And the reason is the synaptic pruning. If that gets derailed, they might do too much pruning, in which case they'll have a smaller volume, or not enough pruning, in which case there'll be a larger volume. And also disorganized white matter, because they're not myelinating it correctly. And it really shows up in the corpus callosum, is people who are heavy marijuana users. It's really disorganized. And these changes are seen throughout the brains of teenage users. It's subtle change. But what I realized from this is people who smoke pot in their teenage years, especially early teenage years, are different. And I knew when I quit smoking pot, something had changed a little bit. I didn't pay too much attention to it. I just thought the marijuana had to get out of my system. When I started studying this, I realized, oh no, I permanently altered. There's no going back to the way it was. And I've tried to spot with my patients. I try to guess ahead of time who used marijuana in the early teens, who didn't. I don't know if I can tell. But I think eventually we'll figure out how to do that. Anyway, using marijuana, there's no safe number of times for a teenager to use marijuana. There's a study that came out this year, and they looked at 46 teenagers who had used marijuana 1 or 2 times before the age of 14. That was it. And they could tell the difference on brain scan. They had larger gray matter volumes, and that's because it disrupted synaptic pruning. So there is, the big concern is teenage use, especially that early teenage use. That is really the big thing, but there's no safe amount, especially for kids, I would say under the age of 16, but we say 18. Okay, marijuana also affects the frontal lobes of the brain. It affects everything. The endocannabinoid system is throughout the brain. But the frontal lobes run executive function, which is our ability to think and plan and strategize, all these human things we do that allow us to make decisions and not kind of live like animals. And this gets affected by marijuana users. And you think about what it's like to live without good executive function, and you get the stereotype blissed out stoner who drifts through life. So this is actually kind of real. If teenagers damage their frontal lobes, there's going to be less ability for complex and strategic thinking. So not as much initiative in life, more willing to just kind of accept whatever happens. It's kind of that blissed out feeling. And the research on this. This is a study that was done at Harvard, and if you know the Stroop color test, it's a test of impulse control. So our normal tendency is when we see things to just read the word. And so you look at this, you go green, red, black, white. But in this test, what people are asked to do is say the color. And so you've got to suppress that impulse to read the word and think and then say the color. So it's a little harder to say blue, green, red, black. It just takes more effort to do that. And so they did the study and they compared marijuana users to non-marijuana users, and they found that the marijuana users did worse on this test. But then they divided them up, and they found out the ones who did worse on the test were the ones who started using marijuana before age 16. The ones who started after age 16 did fine on this test. Then they went and they did MRIs while they were doing the actual Stroop color test. And what they found is there were difference in all three groups. So on the left are the healthy controls, and you can see they used a certain amount of their brain to do this. Then the middle ones are the people who started using after age 16. They were able to do the test just fine, but as you can see, they used more of the brain to do it. So they have some damage, but they're able to compensate for it. And then on the right are the people who started using marijuana in their early teens. And they've done enough damage that they can't even try, and they can't even compensate for it. And that's why it shows up they can't even do the test very well. And so I've started asking my patients, one of the biggest questions I ask them about marijuana, I mean, I should ask them about every drug, what age did you start? But it's really important with pot. So I ask them, what age did you start? And if they say 12 to 13, something in my heart kind of sinks, because there is nothing we can do about it afterwards. You know, cigarettes in a way are very forgiving. I mean, they kill 500,000 people a year, but if you quit by age 30, the body pretty much cleans out from the damage that's done. Marijuana, on the other hand, using one time before the age of 14 has an effect that's just never going to go away.